Okay, guys, so for this session, we're going to be going over Chapter 8, which is the Texas Executive Branch. We're going to start off talking about the governor because in Texas, the governor is going to be the head of our executive branch. And we're going to start off talking about different types of qualifications. Now, if you think back to our last chapter that we covered, Chapter 7, remember that there are informal qualifications and then there are formal qualifications. So we're about to start off talking about the informal qualifications. Those are things that historically we have seen our governor have, attributes that are typical for our governor but not required under law. Okay, so historically our governor has been an Anglo male and has pursued a career in business or law. Today, most often we see Republican governors. 1978, if you think back on Chapter 5, that was the first Republican governor that we'd seen in over 100 years. The only female governor of Texas that we've had before Ann Richards was Miriam A. Ferguson. She served 2 non-consecutive terms, and really she was just kind of the figurehead for her husband, who was really kind of still acting as the governor behind the scenes. So Ann Richards is really the only what I would consider sort of true female Texas governor that we've had who had a true position of leadership and authority. Remember that we said that the Democratic Party on the whole currently seems to have lost its luster on the statewide level. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the case forever. We've talked quite a bit about how potentially the shift to Democrat is going to occur in Texas again, but that's the case for the time being. The Republican primary right now is largely a contest between those business-oriented conservatives that we talked about, so the ones who are more in line with the Tea Party, and the ideological conservatives, who tend to swing a little bit more towards that fundamentalist Christian movement that we were talking about in Chapter 5. On the whole, the people who are elected as governor usually have very well-funded campaigns, which means they typically have a lot of money and they usually tend to move in rather affluent circles. So just to put this in perspective for you, when Greg Abbott was running against Wendy Davis, Greg Abbott spent about $50 million and Wendy Davis spent just below that. That was 2014. We're now in 2020. So that number would be expected to increase as a result of inflation. So you're looking at probably spending more than $50 million to run a successful bid for the governorship. Our governor is going to serve for 4-year terms, and there's no term limits. We're going to talk later on in this chapter about how that can really consolidate power behind one individual. But just know that for the time being, there's no term limits, which means that to some extent, there's not a whole lot of check on the governor's power there. So if we think back on Rick Perry, for example, that would be an example of somebody who served for multiple terms and was able to consolidate a lot of power as Texas governor. Now, there is going to be some check on the governor's power, and that's in the form of impeachment. Impeachment, remember, is just the bringing of formal charges against a public official. So it's the legislative equivalent of indictment for improper conduct in office. It's not a true indictment because it's not criminal in nature. It's basically an investigation, a trial stage, to figure out whether or not this individual should be removed from office, not to figure out whether or not this individual is guilty of a criminal offense. So that is one check that we have on the executive branch, and the governor more specifically, is that there is the option for removal by impeachment. Our governor is compensated fairly well, especially when you compare that to the legislature. So the governor's compensation is actually set by the legislature, and it's currently set at $153,750 annually. That's one of the highest salaries for any of the governors in any of the 50 states. And so that's quite a disparity that we see between what the legislators are making and what the governor is making. Now, what accounts for that? In part, to be fair, our legislators, remember, were designed to be a citizen legislature. So this was only designed to be their part-time job. The governor holds his position or her position as a full-time job. They're expected to be doing this all throughout the year, working in the governor's office. So that's part of why we see some level of disparity, although it doesn't account fully for that full disparity that we see. Okay, the governor is going to have quite a few staff members. Those staff members are going to be really important for a number of reasons. They're going to come in and they're going to evaluate appointees. Now, what do we mean by that? If you think back when we were looking at Chapter 3, and we just had kind of started to do a very brief overview of the executive branch, remember we said that the governor is in a position to appoint individuals to those vacancies on boards and commissions within the executive branch. Well, there are over 200 agencies, boards, and commissions within the Texas executive branch. So we have this huge structure of all of these bureaucratic organizations. And once every 2 years, in staggered terms, a third of those positions are coming up for opening. It's going to be almost impossible for the governor to really have a good understanding of each of those individuals that he's nominating to fill those vacancies. So the result of that is that he's going to be very reliant on his staff to go through and vet those individuals. We're also going to need the staff to serve as legislative liaisons. So you might ask, why is that? Obviously, we're talking about the executive branch, not about the legislature. Well, the reason, remember, is that the bills that are passed, before they can become law, they're going to be signed off on by the governor, or the governor will veto them. So the governor gets a fair amount of say in what that ultimate piece of legislation looks like. If there's something in that particular bill that the governor really doesn't like, then those legislative liaisons can go over to the legislature and explain, hey, the governor's not going to sign off on this bill in its current format. So you might want to make some changes here. Budget preparation. So we're going to see a proposed budget that's created over in the executive branch, and the governor's staff is going to get to work on that, as well as just general communications and scheduling and planning. So the governor's a pretty busy person. He or she is going to have to go in and make a number of appearances, going to have to meet with a variety of individuals. And so just like other important people, the governor is going to need a large staff to handle that. Now, when we talk about what powers does the governor have, we're going to talk about informal powers that are also called extra-legal powers and formal powers that are called legal powers. Let's start with the formal legal powers. These are powers that are stated in law or the state constitution that gives the governor formal authority. Informal or extra-legal powers are powers that are not stated in rules, law, or the Texas Constitution, but they're derived from these legal powers. So if you think back to our chapter on the United States Constitution when we were talking about express and implied powers, in this context, the formal legal powers, those would be the express powers. Those are written into law. Those are things that for sure and certain the governor gets to do. The informal extra-legal powers are like the implied powers. They're powers that are derived from those formal legal powers that the governor gets. So the governor serves as the chief of state. Basically, the governor is going to be our chief figurehead within the state. The governor is going to play a ceremonial role, so just basic things like meeting Boy Scout troops at the Capitol or throwing out the first pitch at a baseball game. Those are all ceremonial roles that the governor can assume. International and federal state relations, this deals really with the governor in D.C. So the governor is going to maintain a small office up in D.C. so that he can basically go in and talk on the federal level with party leaders up there about what's going on. It's also going to be up to the governor to go in and request assistance for the state in the event of the declaration of an emergency. The governor is also going to serve as the party chief. So Texas is a state that has a lot of electoral college votes, which means it's a pretty important state to win for the presidency, and it's a pretty important state when it comes to national issues. The governor of our state tends to be seen as a national party leader. The positions that our governor takes on national issues tend to look a lot like what gets reflected on the national political stage. Okay, so let's talk about some of these powers that the governor has. Let's start with message power. Message power is going to be one of those formal legal powers that we were talking about. Message power is the constitutional power to deliver the state of the state message and special messages to the legislature. And so message power, when we talk about that being a formal legal power, that state of the state address looks pretty similar to the State of the Union address, if you've seen that before. So the State of the Union address is given by the president, who's the head of the national executive branch, and talks about what are the things that are going really well right now, what are some of the challenges that we're facing on the national stage, and what are we planning to do moving forward. The State of the State address is basically the same thing. It's just for Texas instead of the whole nation. And the governor basically appears before a bunch of people at the Capitol and gives that State of the State address, saying basically the same things that are said during the State of the Union address, just on the state level. The governor also has the formal legal ability to declare something an emergency item. Now, this is beneficial because when we're talking about the legislature has constraints in terms of the order that it's allowed to consider pieces of legislation. The legislature can usually hold a floor debate and vote on a bill during the first 60 days of the regular session only if the governor has declared it to be an emergency item, which means that that declaration by the governor becomes pretty important and pretty influential. Budget powers. So we've talked about this before. The governor is going to have the ability to go in and his staff can actually draft a proposed budget to be looked over. The governor is going to have a veto power. Veto just means a power which allows the governor to stop a bill from becoming law. Vetoes in Texas are going to be limited in some ways. So the Texas governor can issue a veto on any piece of legislation that he does not want to see pass into law. If the governor does that, then the governor is required by law, along with his formal power to veto, to actually issue a formal written proclamation that states the reason that the governor is vetoing that piece of legislation. So there's that. Also, the governor does not have the pocket veto in Texas. The governor doesn't have the reduction veto, and the governor does have a line item veto, but only as it relates to the appropriations bill. So there's some veto power there. There's some formal legal powers given to the governor in the form of a veto, but there are some constraints on it as well. Special sessions. Special sessions we've talked about before. Remember, they are limited to a 30-day duration, but the governor may call them as often as he or she wants. So, for example, after Wendy Davis successfully filibustered legislation that we looked at in that clip, That was during the 2013 special session. And within hours, Governor Perry had called a second special session in which the legislation passed. So those special sessions become a pretty big deal. Fact-finding task forces. This often happens when the governor kind of doesn't want to have to take a huge stand on a controversial issue. These are basically a group of individuals who are assembled within the executive branch. Oftentimes they come from different business sectors and bring their different areas of expertise to figure out some recommendations as to what could maybe be done in the future to handle a potential issue. Now, those are some formal legal powers. Let's talk about those informal or extra legal powers that are discussed in your textbook. So let's talk about the message power. The message power is going to be provided by law through the governor's ability to give the state of the state address. But the governor's ability to garner a lot of media attention, that's an informal power. That's not written anywhere into law that the governor has the ability to command a large presence from the media, but nonetheless, it's derived from that message power. Also, the ability to threaten a veto. That's going to be a good example of one of those informal or extra legal powers that we talked about. Nowhere is it written into law that the governor has the ability to threaten to veto a piece of legislation. Nonetheless, that's a really powerful tool the governor has, because it's exceptionally unlikely that the legislature is going to be able to muster the number of votes needed at the end of the session to come in and override the governor's veto. So if the governor vetoes a piece of legislation, it's probably going away. It's not going to pass that legislative term. The end result of that is if the governor threatens a veto, he or she actually has the ability to shape what that legislation ends up looking like. The governor can also go in and threaten to call a special session. So, hey, get your act together, pass this really important piece of legislation. If you don't pass this important piece of legislation, then understand that you're all going to have to stay here and work for a while longer, and that is going to kind of put a cramp in your style. So all of those are going to be informal, extra legal powers that are still very, very powerful tools that the governor has that are derived from those formal legal powers that we talked about. One note on those special sessions before we keep going on. Remember that the governor gets to set the agenda with regards to which pieces of legislation are going to be considered. So the governor has the ability to constrict those special sessions a lot more than governors in some other states. Okay, so now we're going to move on, and we are going to talk about the governor as the chief executive. What are some of those other formal powers that the governor has? The governor has appointive powers. So we're going to switch back to our whiteboard over here real quick. And you guys are going to remember this if you watched the Chapter 3 presentation. So we're going back to the whiteboard. And remember that a third of each of those agencies, boards, and commissions, a third of their membership is going to come up for appointment every 2 years, which means that at the conclusion of 6 years, we are going to have a situation where the governor was able to go in and select everybody who's in a position of power, with the exception of the actual figurehead for that agency, of which, of course, there's still indirect appointive powers. So, okay. So, once every 2 years, 1/3 of those spots are going to open up, and the governor gets to fill them. So at the end of that first 2-year term, the governor is going to have filled 1/3 of the vacancies for all of those agencies within the executive branch that we talked about before. At the end of the full term, at the end of the 4 years, the governor is going to have gone in and appointed 2/3 of all of those positions. And at the end of 6 years, we're going to see that the governor has full control. Now remember, these positions that the governor is appointing, they decide who actually heads up that agency. So the governor doesn't get to select the head, but does have indirect appointive powers by getting to appoint all of these other people who sit on the board or agency in question. So let's go back to our file real quick. Okay, now there is some check, though, on the governor's appointive powers. So the governor has the ability to make these appointments, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So an effective governor is going to use the power of the appointment to the maximum and try to get the Senate on board with approving of his or her appointment. How do these senators know about all of these individuals? Well, they don't. Just like the governor doesn't know about all of these individuals and relies on staff, the senators are going to have to rely on each other to know about these individuals. So there's this thing called senatorial courtesy. This is the tradition of allowing a senator to reject the governor's appointment of a political enemy from the senator's district. So if you're looking to make it into one of these agencies in the executive branch, you really don't want to upset the senator from your home district, because if they don't like you, then the other senators are not going to vote to confirm your position. So that's one check that we see on the governor's abilities. The governor also has removal powers, but remember we talked about in Chapter 3, those removal powers are going to be limited. So the governor can go in and remove any of his or her own appointments, but not appointments made by his or her predecessor. Law enforcement powers on the whole are pretty limited. Military powers, the governor is going to have the ability to go in and deploy the state guard. The state guard is basically there in the event that the National Guard is deployed and the state needs to be defended. And the governor's also going to have clemency powers. So what do we mean when we say clemency powers? Clemency powers are the governor's powers to pardon, parole, and grant reprieves to convicted criminals. All that means is the governor has the ability to show leniency in punishment. Now, it used to be that the governor had pretty much unfettered leniency. The governor could do whatever he or she wanted. The problem with that was that there was some abuse of the system. And so what happened is within the executive branch, we set up the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which is basically going to serve as sort of a check on the governor's power. So the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles gets to make recommendations on clemency. The governor is the individual who signs off on those recommendations. So the governor can agree or disagree with the recommendation of clemency. If the governor disagrees, the governor does not have to sign off on that. But if the governor agrees that clemency should be granted, the governor can't grant any more clemency than that recommended by the board. So the governor still has broad clemency power, but, and for purposes of this chapter, because we're going to talk about this more later on, remember, clemency just means leniency when it comes to punishment for like a criminal offense. While the governor does have pretty broad authority, we've constrained it somewhat by that Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. Okay, so the lieutenant governor, let's talk about him. So our current lieutenant governor is going to be Dan Patrick. We talked about before that the lieutenant governor is going to have dual roles. So the lieutenant governor is going to serve in both the Texas legislative branch as the presiding officer over the Texas Senate, and then remember is also going to serve as part of the executive branch. This individual is going to succeed the governor in the event that the governor were to resign before his or her term or for some reason be unable to fulfill his or her duties. So president of the Senate and part of the executive branch. Another thing that the lieutenant governor is an ex officio chair of the Legislative Budget Board and the Legislative Council. So if you think back to our conversations on the legislature, remember that both of those organizations are very powerful. The Legislative Budget Board, remember, is going to be in charge of making those proposed budget recommendations on the legislative side. And the Legislative Council, remember, has a lot to do with redistricting as well as controlling information flow. So what does it mean to be an ex officio chair of something? What that means is that you serve in that capacity simply by virtue of the fact that you hold another role. So the lieutenant governor automatically gets to serve as chair of the Legislative Budget Board and the Legislative Council, not because of any particular qualifications or anything special about that individual, other than the fact that that individual is the lieutenant governor. So they get basically a de facto role on both that board and that council. Those are extremely important positions that carry a great deal of weight and authority, and so it's a really big deal. Okay, so we talked about the governor, and then we've talked about the lieutenant governor. Now we're going to go on, and we're going to talk about the attorney general. So the attorney general is going to be the lawyer for all officials, boards, and agencies within the state of Texas. And the attorney general is going to interpret the Constitution through opinions. These opinions are known as attorney general's opinions. They are interpretations of the Constitution, statutory laws, or administrative rules. Now, what happens is maybe an agency wants to enact a rule, but it's not sure whether or not it's constitutional. So they write over to the Texas AG, and our current Texas AG is Ken Paxton. He's made the news recently. If you are watching this in my Maymaster course, if you're watching the salon owner, Ken Paxton has come out squarely in support of the salon owner. And so he's a pretty political and controversial figure at the moment. But what he does is they write over to him and they ask for an opinion. Do you think this rule that we want to enact is going to be unconstitutional or violate some other rule that we have? As the chief attorney for the state, the attorney general writes back an opinion, but that opinion becomes public. And it's non-binding, but it's highly persuasive because the attorney for the state is the one who's writing it, first of all. And then secondly, if that agency goes against his or her opinion, then they're on their own. The AG will not be representing them in litigation. That means that can be very, very expensive to that particular agency. So while non-binding, those attorney general opinions are pretty important. The attorney general represents the state in civil and criminal litigation. Most often we see civil litigation, though. So think about when Texas was mad about the Affordable Care Act. It's going to be the Texas AG whose job it is to hop into that litigation and file briefs there. Okay, Comptroller of Public Accounts. This is going to be an individual who is basically in charge of managing the financial activities of the state government. So our current comptroller is going to be Glenn Hager. He serves as the chief tax collector for the state and really importantly certifies the state's approximate biennial revenue. So this is the person who's basically in charge of making sure that we have a fairly balanced budget, which with everything going on right now with the whole COVID-19 issue is looking pretty scary for that particular individual. So that part about certifying the state's approximate biennial revenue, the reason that's important is this individual's job is to go in and try to project how much revenue does he or she think that the state of Texas is going to bring in over the course of the next 2 years. And from that, the state is able to plan its appropriations budget. So just like you need to know how much money you're going to have coming in so that you can plan how much you're going to spend on rent and food and all of those other things, the same thing is happening on the state level. So this position is very important because if the comptroller gets it wrong, that can be a really big deal. Okay, some of the lesser positions that we're going to talk about, the Commissioner of Agriculture is going to administer laws for both consumer and labor protection. It can sometimes create a little bit of a conflict of interest. There's a typo on this slide. It should say the Commissioner of the General Land Office is going to manage and collect incomes from rentals and leases for state-owned lands. Remember, that's going to be a big deal when it comes to that permanent school fund that's in charge of making sure that we have enough money for Texas public primary and secondary schools. Okay, so remember in Texas we have this kind of weird hybrid system. So we've got the plural executive and then we've got an appointed cabinet system. So we've kind of got a weird hybrid. What we just went through and looked at, that represented the plural executive. Those individuals, the voters, are going in and voting into office. Now we're about to study the appointed executives. So who does the governor actually get to appoint? Okay, let's start with the Secretary of State, which in a lot of ways is going to be one of the most important positions within the executive branch. The Secretary of State is the keeper of the seal of the state and also serves as the chief election officer for Texas. He or she is going to administer Texas election laws, maintain voter registration records, and receive election results. So let's start first with that part about keeper of the seal of the state. What does that mean? Well, the Secretary of State is the person who keeps all the business records filings. So when you go in and you create whatever it is that you want to create, let's say that you create a corporation or an LLC. Well, it's going to be the Secretary of State's job to keep all of those business records and documents. So that's one part of the Secretary of State's really important job. Another important part, and probably the more important part in actuality, is the election process. So the Secretary of State is in charge of maintaining the voting rolls for the state of Texas. That means that the Secretary of State is in charge of adding individuals to the voting roll when they register to vote and are eligible to do so, and removing them when they are ineligible. If you think back to our conversation on the Bush versus Gore election, remember everything hinged on Florida. Well, the Florida Secretary of State had messed up, and there were actually some people removed from the rolls who should have been on there, which potentially made a difference in terms of the actual election of our president of the United States, because it was a really, really close race. Every time they did the counts, it got closer and closer. So that Secretary of State position is a really big deal. If you watch Texas in the news, our Secretary of State was in trouble not that long ago because our Secretary of State sent letters to a bunch of individuals who were recently naturalized citizens. They were eligible to vote. And those letters basically said, we think that you voted when you weren't allowed to vote. And so you might be subject to criminal penalties as a result. Well, that obviously has the end result of deterring those individuals from probably voting in the future, which is a big, big deal because they lawfully had the right to vote. So Texas, and by Texas I mean the taxpayers, so you, ended up having to pay out a pretty large settlement. So that Secretary of State job is a pretty important one. The next job that we're going to talk about that's appointed is going to be the Adjutant General. This is the state's top-ranking military officer. This is the individual who's going to exercise administrative jurisdiction over the Texas National Guard and the Texas State Guard. Texas Health and Human Services Commissioner, that's going to be the individual who oversees various departments in health and human services. So if you think about like child protective services or adult protective services, or if you think about any of the various social welfare programs that the state administers, sorry, y'all, I'm trying to do these like back to back, and so it's just a lot of information to cover. Anyways, so this is the person who's basically in charge of all of those different departments. The Insurance Commissioner. This is going to be the person who is in charge of the Texas Insurance Commission in Texas. This is the commission that's basically in charge of regulating the insurance industry here. So making sure that they pay out on claims that they're supposed to and that they don't do anything bad on the whole. This individual is the one that's in charge of overseeing them. And then finally, we have the Commissioner of Education, which for obvious reasons is going to be a pretty big deal. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about those different boards and commissions. There are different types of boards and commissions in Texas. So far we've only focused on those appointed boards, but there are also other boards like elective boards and ex officio boards. So the appointed boards, an example of that would be the TCEQ that we talked about really early on in this course, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. The governor is going to get to go in and make those appointments in those staggered 6-year terms. Once every 2 years, a third come up that we talked about and confirmed by the Senate. But there are also elective boards. So examples of elective boards include the Texas Railroad Commission and the Texas State Board of Education. The Texas Railroad Commission is actually one of the most important state regulatory boards in the United States. It's a constitutionally authorized elective board whose 3 members serve for overlapping 6-year terms. The governor fills vacancies on the board, and these appointees serve until the next general election, at which time they may win elections to the board in their own right. So I know it gets a little bit confusing because it seems like the Texas Railroad Commission should be in charge of regulating railroads for obvious reasons, but it's not. Why it's so important is that it's in charge of overseeing oil and gas interests in the state of Texas. And obviously that's a huge industry for us here. So they have a lot of power. The Texas State Board of Education is another example of an elective board and is also a very important board because the SBOE is in charge of setting curriculum standards for the state, as well as adopting which textbooks our public school system is going to adopt. They also set the standards for teachers in Texas. So certification standards, what it takes for a teacher to be hired here, what should result in dismissal. They set the overall guidelines. It's up to the independent districts to go in and actually implement those guidelines, but the State Board of Education is the one who's actually setting the guidelines there. And then we have ex officio boards. An example of this is the Texas Bond Review Board. So ex officio boards are going to be really similar in nature to when we studied ex officio office holders. These are individuals, these are boards that are staffed by individuals who are on this board simply by virtue of another office that they hold. So that gives you a brief overview of some of the different types of boards and commissions that we have in Texas. Okay, so what does our executive branch look like as a whole? In general, it looks like a large bureaucracy. It's very big, and it's increased dramatically over time. So we have over 200 of those regulatory bodies that we were discussing that make up the executive branch. And that number, in general, has continued to grow. One thing that we've seen is a lot of people criticize this idea of bureaucracy. They feel like it's just multiple levels of bureaucratic red tape that they have to get through before an ultimate decision can be made. And so you've seen some people argue that maybe we should have some level of privatization within the executive branch. Privatization is just the hiring of private contractors to perform government services and perform government functions. So if any of you have watched Orange is the New Black on Netflix, that's an example of privatization. It's prison privatization, where instead of the government going in and hiring individuals and overseeing their day-to-day operations, instead they basically contract with a private corporation to take on some of those usually considered to be governmental roles. Now, that has a lot of conservative support, but if you've watched Orange is the New Black, you know there's obviously people who are opposed to things like that. It can open the state up to a fair amount of corruption, and while it can sometimes be good for the state's bottom line, because if it's a private corporation that's running something like the prison system, then they're going to be concerned about the bottom line, and they're going to make sure that they cut costs and that it's more cost effective on the whole. The problem with that is, though, if we imprison people, they still have constitutional rights. And at that point, it's our role as the government to make sure that we are providing them with their constitutional rights. And so if we're not, because we're trying to cut too many corners, that can really create a problem. So we've seen a lot of conservative support there, but we've also seen a lot of liberal pushback. In Texas, we have a spoils system. Spoils system is a system in which elected officials hire campaign workers as public employees. So one of those, it's not what you know, it's who you know. They're going in and hiring their friends. Contract spoils, or contract patronage, as you're going to see it referred to in your course, is a practice in which politicians award contracts to their political supporters and contributors in the business community. This contract patronage is one of the arguments that we see against privatization. So we don't want somebody to get that prison contract just because they were somebody else's friend. Okay, so in Texas, the characteristics of our bureaucracy, a traditional bureaucracy is going to be arranged as a true hierarchy. A true hierarchy is one in which there are structures in which several employees are going to report to a higher administrator, who reports to higher authorities until eventually all report to the single individual with ultimate authority. But in Texas, we don't have a true hierarchy. So not all of these agencies, boards, and commissions are really accountable to the governor. Instead, they're accountable to their agency head, which, remember, the governor indirectly appointed by appointing the individuals who were in charge of selecting that agency head. So there's some evidence of hierarchy within places like the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, but for the executive branch as a whole, we really lack that hierarchical structure, which can create a little bit of disorganization because it means that those different agencies are all kind of operating on their own. So if you've ever heard the expression, the left hand doesn't necessarily know what the right hand is doing, that's one of the problems that we see in Texas, is that potentially that hierarchy creates a little bit of difficulty. Other criticisms that we've seen have been that a lot of people feel like there's not enough neutrality within our executive branch. So we don't have a statewide civil service or merit system. Instead, we rely on that patronage system that we were talking about before. A civil service or merit system would be what we see on the federal level. It's basically an employment system that uses competitive examinations or other objective measures of qualifications, like how many years of experience you have, what degrees you have, things like that, for hiring and promoting employees. So one thing that we've seen are attempts to depoliticize with independent boards and commission systems. We've seen some success on the local government level in that they use nonpartisan elections. But for right now, it seems like the civil service system is really not making the traction that a lot of people who are critics of this system would hope it is. A power inherent in any professional bureaucracy stems from administrators' ability to shape public policy because of their knowledge of a given subject. Policy-making officials, such as the legislature and governor, are seldom as informed in policy-making areas as administrative personnel, who have often built a career in a single area of government activity. And that's one of the reasons that it might be good if we could see more of a civil service system develop here in the state. Okay, this slide deals with clientele groups. And so this should really just be a refresher over what we studied when we were in Chapter 6 talking about those special interest groups. Remember, when we talk about clientele groups, we're talking about those groups that are supposed to be regulated by a particular agency within the executive branch. Remember that because of the really close alliance that they formed, think of the iron triangle, you see a real sharing of information, and usually the agency and the clientele group tend to share common attitudes and goals. One of the ways in which they do this, remember, is those special interest groups are going to target the appointment process so that we have a continual exchange of employees between those clientele groups and the agencies that are supposed to regulate them. Now, in Chapter 6, we referred to this as co-optation, but another word for this that this chapter of your textbook uses is agency capture. So agency capture is an agency created to regulate an industry, becomes controlled by the very industry it is supposed to regulate, to the detriment of the public interest. So it's basically just a different vocabulary term for what we've already studied in Chapter 6 when we talked about co-optation of the executive branch. All right, so let's go back to the governor. The governor, remember, when we're talking about the governor in relationship to these agencies, the governor has a lot of power because the governor has a lot of appointive power for a lot of these boards. So these agencies want to be on the governor's good side. The governor's support provides greater bargaining power with legislators and also with interest groups. Okay, so public policy and the Iron Texas Star. The Iron Texas Star is just referring to one of those political theories that we were talking about before. So if you visualize a star, these are going to be the different points on that star. And so similar to that iron triangle that we studied before in Chapter 7, you're going to see these various points on the star communicating with one another and exchanging information, which can be good, but also can result in some degree of maybe having too much cohesion between these actors and that agency capture that we talked about before. Agencies depend on their legislative allies. So the support of the lieutenant governor and the speaker is going to be most important to them. Also, they're going to rely on the Finance and Appropriations Committees, the Legislative Budget Board, and the Legislative Council, all of which make a lot of sense, right? Because if we're talking about how much money an agency may or may not receive, then they're probably going to care a lot about what's happening in the Legislative Budget Board or the Appropriations Committees, because those are going to be the people who are in charge of figuring out how much funding they get. So even though the executive branch is separate from the legislative branch, we can see some level of accountability as well as some level of reliance here. It's almost like an informal check that we have on the executive branch. So agencies are going to be able to control information, and they can control it to benefit the agency or constituent interest. And they're also able to go in, remember, and write those rules that we were talking about. So the proposed rules that appear in the Texas Register, once they become actual rules, they become known as a type of law. So remember, we said we had statutory law that was written by the legislature. We've talked about common law, which is just a series of judicial precedents. And now we're going to talk about administrative law. Administrative law are the rules and regulations that are written by administrators to implement public policy. So remember, when we talked about the Texas Register, we said that the executive branch has a lot of discretion as to how it implements the broad public policies of the Texas legislature. When they go in and they decide that they're going to enact a new rule, that is known as an administrative law. Almost all administrative laws get administrative review, and there's also administrative law enforcement functions. So those bureaucracies that are proposing the rules and ultimately implementing them, they're in charge of regulating enforcement. In addition to being able to regulate enforcement, they are also going to have the ability to go in and change those administrative laws later on if they decide that a change would be appropriate. And there's also a level of checks that occurs because there are going to be special administrative law courts that deal specifically with these administrative laws, with the rules that the executive branch is implementing. So now let's talk about some of the ways that people push for accountability reform and some of the reforms that we've already seen put into effect. So one thing that we've seen is elective accountability. Elective accountability is a process in which electing executive officers allows for the bureaucracy to directly be accountable to the people through the democratic process. If you think about the fact that we said the cabinet system, remember, is only part of the equation in Texas, we also have that plural executive. That plural executive is really designed as elective accountability, so accountability to the people. Here's a good example of that. Let's switch over to the whiteboard again real quick. Okay, let's pretend that we had a cabinet system. And let's say in this cabinet system, we've got the governor up here. And then let's say the governor goes in and in our cabinet system is going to appoint the lieutenant governor. So we've got governor up here at the top, got the lieutenant governor below. Okay, well, let's imagine a situation where you thought the governor was doing a fantastic job, but you thought the lieutenant governor was really screwing up in the Texas Senate. Well, if we had a true cabinet, what would happen in Texas in that situation? What would be your only recourse? Your only recourse would be to go in and vote the governor out. But we liked what the governor was doing. And that seems like a pretty extreme measure and really only indirectly gets the lieutenant governor out of office. So allowing for that plural executive gives accountability to the people. There's also already some degree of legislative accountability. So your textbook, this edition doesn't talk about it as much, but there's going to be a Texas Sunset Advisory Commission. It's basically their job to go in and review whether or not the charters for those different agencies should be reviewed after a set number of years. So there's accountability to the legislature in that we have the executive branch going in and really getting to review on its own, but then also that information is going to be taken over from the Sunset Advisory Board and provided to the Legislative Budget Board and to the Appropriations Committee. And that committee and the Appropriations Board are going to get to look at that information and decide, okay, do we think that we should probably fund these agencies? How much do we think we should fund these agencies? So there's legislative accountability as well as executive accountability. There's also open meetings laws. These are laws that require that meetings of government bodies at all levels of government be open to the general public. There are some exceptions to this. If we're talking about a personnel matter, that's going to be a closed session. So if we're talking about like disciplining somebody, that's going to be something that is confidential, just like it would be in a private context. If we're talking about land acquisition, that's another area that's going to be closed off. And if you think about that, that makes a lot of sense because the state of Texas is going to have the ability to acquire land just the same way that an individual is. And just like when you submit a bid for a piece of personal real estate, like a $300,000 house, you don't want anyone else who's bidding against you really to know about that $300,000 bid before you make it. Because then what are they going to do? They're going to go in and they're going to bid $300,001, right? They're going to try to outbid you by a little bit. So for land acquisition deals, we allow those to be closed. Also, if we're dealing with any sort of legislation against the state has attorney-client privilege just the way an individual would. So we're going to allow for closed sessions there. But understand that for the most part, the general rule is that we have open meeting laws. And the reason for that is we want to allow accountability and transparency in our executive branch. We also have whistleblower protections. Whistleblowers are government employees who expose bureaucratic excesses, blunders, corruption, or favoritism. So if you watch what's happening on the federal system just recently, you're probably familiar with the term whistleblower. But we basically have put protections into law that are designed to make it so that people can call out their superiors and say when there's something wrong, and they don't have to worry about losing their job or not being promoted. We've also allowed for open records. Open records are laws that just require most records to be kept by the government to be open by the public. So again, this allows for accountability and transparency to the people. So if you wanted to see a particular governmental contract that had been entered into, you could request it through an open records request. And the state is supposed to provide it to you unless there's any sort of like confidential information in there. Like, so if there's a social security number or something like that, it can be redacted or removed. But generally speaking, just publicly available data should be available to individuals within the state. They can charge you a fee, but it can't be an exorbitant fee. So they could charge you 10 cents a page for each copy they make because the government is incurring expense for you to see this particular document, but they couldn't charge you $100 a page because that wouldn't really promote transparency or be fair. The final thing that we've done to try to go in and modify our system to impose some reforms is we've instituted ombudsman. And ombudsman is an independent official who takes, investigates, and mediates complaints about government bureaucrats or policy. So if you were to go in as a vulnerable individual, somebody who is receiving state nursing home care, and you felt like you were being deprived of rights that you were supposed to receive, if you sued, it would be a really costly, very expensive process that you probably don't really have the resources for because you're in a state nursing home. So an ombudsman is basically somebody who is appointed by the state, who serves as an independent official, whose job it is to make sure that the state stays in check to some degree without individuals having to go and seek some form of equity through a private legal system. So that gives you a pretty good overview, hopefully, of Chapter 8. That's a lot of information. I feel like I can't even talk anymore. So if you have any questions, let me know. As always, you can shoot me an email, or we can set up that Blackboard Collaborate session. I've gone ahead and put some videos up in that video resource link that we talked about before. So that's another area that you can explore as well. And until next chapter, have a good evening or morning or whenever you're watching this. And we will pick up next time with Chapter 9.